All right. Thank you very much. We're going to welcome one of the last speakers back because one of our speakers, Tilly Chang, had to cancel with her excuses because her flight, 6 a.m. flight out of San Francisco, was not taking off because of the smoke. So Salita, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about data. We're going to be talking about the way in which it can be leveraged for usable and beneficial outcomes in transport. And as we start this conversation, I want to turn to you, those that are sitting, those of you that are standing in the back, and I want to ask you a question. And that question is, it's simple hands up. How many of you feel that data in the mobility sphere, data is a public good? How many of you agree with that?
Sorry.
Yep. Is that okay? How many of you strongly disagree with that? All right, so that's going to give us an idea of how we're going to orient this discussion. I'm going to turn to our panelists. We have 4 panelists. Salita Reynolds needs no introduction. She's the general manager of LADOT, one of my heroes in the mobility world, so I'm very glad that you can come in.
Philippe. Thank you.
Next to her is Regina Clulo. You are the CEO and founder of Populous. And so we're looking forward, and also a scholar, as we've met before in your scholarly life. So I'm looking forward to your insights into this. Lisa Joy Rossner, you are the CMO of Autonomo. And we'll be talking a bit about Autonomo's work and bringing in one of the hidden data realms when we talk about data availability, and this is data around the car. And finally, my friend Chris Ballinger, founder and CEO of the Mobility Open Blockchain Initiative, #Mobi, one of the key actors right now in not just blockchain, but looking at the way in which data science can enable some beneficial outcomes in the mobility space. So I'm going to turn to you. Maybe I'll start with Chris, since you're at the end, to answer that same question. Do you feel that data is a public good in the mobility sphere, a bit like roads and infrastructure? Or what type of data do you feel is a public good?
So maybe we can start with what is a public good, and I won't give you the long economist definition, I'll give you the short economist definition.
The short economist version, please.
which is the classic public good is non-rivalrous, meaning my consumption doesn't affect your consumption of the same good, and non-excludable. And the classic public good is a lighthouse, right? Where if I see the lighthouse and stare away from the rocks, it doesn't stop you from doing the same thing, and you can't make me pay for that lighthouse service once the lighthouse is there. And often public goods have one additional characteristic, which is severely declining marginal costs, which can give rise to natural monopolies and concentration of economic power. So the real question is not, in theory, whether data is a public good, but are markets efficiently dealing with the market imperfections, with the breakdowns caused by these aspects of public goods? And I think that's one that you can argue on both sides of. On the one hand, you can see the enormous progress and the change in lives that data and these large data platforms and natural data monopolies, and in particular the largest companies in the world have created. On the other hand, we all have to be concerned about the concentration of power caused by those monopolies. So I think the real question is where do we want data? Not is data a public good, but where can markets be improved by making data a public good and providing a more level playing field by making sure that all players in a market have access to equal data.
Mm-hmm. Regina, you use a lot of data in your work. In fact, your work is built on data. So how do you view that question of what part of data is a public good? Is data a public good generally? Or are there specific elements that you feel are strongly characteristic of public good properties?
So I think one of the really big challenges that's emerged over the last 6 years is that there's been this wealth of data that's being generated in the private sector that the public sector hasn't had access to in order to plan transportation policy, develop infrastructure. And so there's been this real need to really open up much of that data that's being generated by mobility services such as shared vehicles, shared bikes, shared scooters. And what we do is help ingest that data and provide provide it to the public sector in a way that's secure, that they can utilize it. I do think that when we talk about data as a public good, we need to define what the data is. I think there are a lot of folks who are concerned about the personally identifiable information that might be extracted from data. Some folks make the argument that maybe we, as citizens, should be able to own our data. So I think you can look at it from a lot of different perspectives, and at the end of the day, what's most important is defining what data are we talking about, because yes, there are certain forms of data that should be made publicly available, that should be considered a public good, that don't compromise some of those concerns that people have about privacy and even competitive intelligence, which a lot of mobility operators may understandably have.
Yeah. Privacy is, of course, one of the key aspects of autonomous work in this area. So what is your take on data as a public good?
Well, it's interesting. You pretty much took the words right out of my mouth, Regina. And I do think that it depends on the data type. And when we're looking at mobility, how is the data coming out of cars, particularly when we're looking at it for smart city from, say, air traffic control data, right? We need that data to maintain the flows. So back to your point, it depends on the data and how it's used, but more importantly, how the data is masked and anonymized so that personally identified PII information is not compromised.
Salita, is data a public good?
So I would say that something slightly different, which is that the public good are the services that cities offer. And in exchange, we should be able to earn data that improves those services. That the services I provide as the Department of Transportation are that I manage and price parking, which means I also manage and price the curb. I deliver infrastructure, I design the street, I control movement on the street with traffic signals and signs and all of those other things. Those are services I provide. They're really static right now because of the tools that have been available up until this point. Steel, concrete, traditional infrastructure tools. They must become more dynamic in the future in order to unlock the services that can deliver public good. And public good are things like, avoiding monopolies and concentration of power. They're things like protecting people's privacy so that privacy does not become a luxury, and potentially even putting citizens in charge of when their data has value to a private company. There are things like doing things in open source, right? These are sort of public values and public good that we should be thinking about as we're thinking about data, and we're thinking about it as an output of a service that we provide.
I'm going to stay with you, Salita, because so for those of you who don't know, the International Transport Forum is an intergovernmental organization where I work for 59 member countries around the world, and we scan through all of our membership to try to help understand what are the best cases, but it's best use cases in a number of different domains. And when we think about data management and data openness and data formats and standards, we have tended to look to the world leaders in our views, which tend to be in Nordic and Scandinavian countries. But that's no longer the case. And one of the world leaders in terms of formatting and thinking about the syntax of data is actually Los Angeles with the recent...
Is that LADOT in the house?
with the recent formulation of the Mobility Data Standard, which is a language that enables this exchange of data. And what's interesting about it is it has two components. It's a two-way protocol that allows authorities to communicate to operators and allows operators to communicate to authorities. So Salita, can you tell us, if you've been at this conference, then you've probably been under a rock if you haven't heard of the Mobility Data Specification. So I won't ask you to describe it completely, but can you tell us a little bit about what it is and what trajectory you see for it in terms of its uptake beyond Los Angeles as a de facto standard?
So I think first, before getting into that, we have been thinking deeply about this at LADOT for the last 4 years or so, and we did our homework. We put out a document called Urban Mobility in a Digital Age. It was written by Ashley Hand, who now works for Citify. She was a fellow at LADOT. She engaged people who were thinking about how cities prepare for digital disruption and the arrival of autonomy and electrification. That document was a direct response to Mayor Garcetti's Sustainable City Plan, which called for tremendous changes in both the fuel economy of the fleet at large and also changes in the mode split and the way people got around. And it was clear to me that, there's the policy, and now I need a different toolbox in order to get to that policy. The policies don't change just because the technology does. And so before any of this, the MDS is an expression of our policy in technology. And it's important to do that thinking about what is the right role of the public sector. And it's important to take risks and fail in order to sort of figure out where we ought to be. So we had put out this strategic implementation plan to go along with Urban Mobility and Digital Age, and it had articulated this philosophy of active management of the public realm. Because departments of transportation do planning and investment, yes, but we also manage and operate a system of systems that is incredibly complex, changes minute by minute, and must have 100% accuracy. Traffic signals cannot be 99% accurate. They cannot have, offsets of milliseconds because people die. So, we're thinking about how are we going to build ourselves a set of tools in order to start building a city operating system. And scooters showed up.
Boom.
So we were thinking about, how do we manage and operate the infrastructure of the future, the digital version of our current infrastructure, and we're going to take a year and a half to build that out. And then it was like, oh no, actually you got to build it out next month. So we built 2 sets of APIs and we published them in GitHub and open. And the first set is cool, but not super revolutionary. It says, instead of me learning 13 different company languages, all of your APIs, you're going to go to public school and learn my language. And when I get your data and I tap you on the shoulder and I ask you to give me information, you're going to give it to me in this format. But the second set of APIs is the quantum leap forward that really starts to open up opportunities for me to manage and operate infrastructure differently, not just for scooters, but for everything up to and including autonomous vehicles and air taxis and drones, which is the agency set of APIs, which says to companies now, the city has always been in your product workflow, but we were in your product workflow in analog, and now we're going to be in your product workflow in digital. So if you're on a scooter and you want to stop it in the middle of the LA River, and you want to hit the button that says end trip, the app will ping the city's operating system and say, can you end this trip here? And the city's operating system will answer back and say yes or no.
Preferably no.
Mostly no, right? We're government. We mostly say no. But the way that the companies manage that interaction with the consumer is about their user experience, and they can do that however they like. But we need to have an elegant tool to enforce the policy and regulation that City Council has set. And this is really the best way of doing it. And the cool thing about MDS is that we launched it, and about 10 cities immediately either adopted it in whole or in part. We had companies start to build products on top of it, which is exactly what we wanted. And then we had companies say, we actually want to invest in building out the code itself. We love this. We would love to create a standard for car sharing. And so now the city is in our right role. We're doing what we do best, which is to manage and operate the infrastructure. We're owning what we need to own, which is the data and the code. And companies now, you understand how to compete in this ecosystem to do things like avoid monopolies and keep data private and all of those things.
Regina, you work a lot with data, and I imagine that having MDS generalized will make your job easier to actually build on the data that's available, add your special sauce that provides value to your customers. But I want to ask you a question, then I'll turn to to some of the other speakers about this point. The MDS is built on available data. What about the data that isn't available? Do we run the risk, because you work in this space, do we run the risk of missing out on important parts of transport activity just because they don't produce data? Cars are one element of that. People walking are another element of that. And from your perspective, how do you see us moving forward to bring that kind of data into this data sphere?
That's a great question. So I've been working in the transportation space for a little over a decade, most of the last 6 years focused on helping cities and public sector understand the adoption and use of new mobility services when they first started arriving in commercial form, primarily with Uber and Lyft. And one of the key things that I think a lot of cities and regions are realizing is that in addition to this wealth of data that's being generated directly by vehicles, which are mostly used by, broadly speaking, higher income individuals sometimes, then there are potentially a group of people who are being left out, and really understanding, what are the actual adoption rates, what are the reasons that people who aren't using these services, why are they not using it? Is it because they're unbanked? Is it because they're too expensive? Is it because they're not accessible? So we actually aggregate, in addition to real-time data from scooter companies, bike companies, car sharing companies, we also gather data to basically complete the picture so that cities can use that for planning purposes. There are a host of other data sets that are out there that we have started integrating as well. And that is the challenge, is to really develop the complete picture, because as we see the future of mobility evolve, we don't want to build it for one select portion of our population.
Are we on the same time frames, though, in that space? Because Salita, you're talking about second by second, real time. The other kind of data information that we have on how people move tends to come from origin destination travel surveys. They're infrequent, they're expensive. Is that time frame issue an important one, and do you have some ideas of how to address that, to make more actionable insight onto these other users of our transport systems?
So I think that...
And feel free to jump.
That it is true. Regional surveys are often collected once every 5 years, sometimes once every 10 years. They tend to be very expensive. They tend to be custom. And what we do at Populous is actually collect more frequent data that is similar, that can be used, and then combined and aggregated with this big data, real-time data, that cities are now able to, miraculously, because dockless scooters arrived everywhere, and cities are able to develop policies to require them to share data on those, and then probably other services in the future, develop a pretty comprehensive picture when you combine those two types of data.
Okay. Just on since you work with car data, and car data is part of the data that is not has not traditionally been real time, has not been available in large quantities. How is Autonomo working to integrate car data into this better mobility picture?
So I actually didn't hear the end of that.
Oh, sorry.
question.
The acoustics are really
We're
bad.
supposed to lean in, right?
We're leaning in. We're leaning in. One of the big data sources that are missing in terms of real-time or closer to real-time data is data on how people are using their cars, of course, and yet that represents most of the traffic in cities. So Autonomo is working with OEMs to integrate some of that data into usable tools, usable insight. Can you tell us a bit about how you're doing that within Autonomo? And then I want to ask about some of the privacy issues that are related to that.
Okay, so we're working with pretty much all the OEMs, and kind of to the point you were making, the data that comes out of the cars are all coming out in, let's call them, different languages. And so instead of making all of them go to public school, they can come to us, and we're like a Rosetta Stone. And so the data comes out, it's dirty, and it's also in a different language, and we unify that data and make it available. So you asked about what we're seeing. We see today anywhere from as small as just 5 data points that are usable coming out of a vehicle to as many as 500. And they can be used for many different things, but traffic flow management is a really big and important one. And I think what you're doing is really fascinating. Mashing up those two data sets could really help give you a better picture of what's happening in the city. Now, with regards to your question around privacy, so I am not from the auto industry. I've been in data and analytics for about 26 years, and I spent a lot of time studying consumers and how they feel about the way their data is being used. I worked in ad tech, I worked in e-commerce, and now with data in the connected car, there really are a lot of questions. The OEMs are the stewards of that data, but really the owners of the data are the owners of the car, the drivers themselves. And so back in May, when there was the big Cambridge Analytica scandal, I decided to survey connected car owners, those consumers you were talking about, to ask them, right now, when you're most worried, how do you feel about your data being used and shared? We surveyed about 1,000 owners across demographics across the United States, and the results were quite fascinating. I was surprised. So first we asked them if they want services, and the biggest level of interest was in navigation, emergency services, anything that was convenience-oriented and safety-oriented in the high 90th percentile, but even some services that don't yet exist, like in-vehicle delivery, there was a 45% interest. So then we said to the consumers, you want this convenience, but this requires you to share your data. Are you willing to share your data? Now remember, this was in May, when privacy was in all the headlines. I'll ask you guys, since I can't really see out there, what percentage do you think said, yes, I'm still willing to share my data?
I would guess a vast majority.
Yeah.
You're right, 80% across the board. But then we asked them, have you ever not used a service or an app because you're worried about data privacy? And 60% said yes. So we asked them, what would give you confidence? And they said trust and transparency, being able to see how my data is being used. And then we asked them, who do you trust? So we let them write in who you trust, and it was, believe it or not, it was Google, Apple, and Amazon, right?
Those are the ones that people trusted
Right?
the most. Can I just ask for a show of hands? Who do you trust? And I'm going to give you three choices, and tell me if they're the right choices. So we'll talk about, let's take Google as a proxy. Google, a mobility provider, or let's pick Uber or Lyft, either one, or LA DOT. So who here, which of you believe that Google and those other companies are the best stewards of your data? Show your hands.
Is none of the above?
Or none of the above. So a few people. Okay, how about some of the mobility service operators? And I'm not limiting it to Lyft or Uber, but mobility service operators that are collecting your data. How many of you feel that those are the real stewards, the best stewards of your data? Okay, and how about LA DOT?
Really nobody from Uber in the audience?
So okay, that's interesting. So we're tending more, but this is, and how about none of the above?
Yeah, that's more like it.
Okay, so
well, and so then we, first we gave them the option to fill in who do you trust, and then we gave them categories, and it was really interesting. So the most trusted category was your bank. And that actually makes sense. This summer, someone stole my credit card and spent $500 at a Chick-fil-A, which is something I would never do.
What?
And
Chick-fil-A is delicious, so let's be real.
but that's a whole other debate. But
Wasn't me.
it was.
within sub-seconds, my bank intercepted that, and I know they have my back. And then the next category was their carriers, and the numbers were really high, in the high 70s. Number 3 was automotive OEMs. 77% of consumers trust their OEM. Now, social media platforms were at about 20, really 10. And the government was in the high 40s, close to 50. It was really, really interesting data. I have all kinds of stats, but those are the highlights. And it really gave me visibility into where our early adopters, where our connected car drivers are. And they want everything that you are working to deliver for them. We just have to treat them respectfully.
I'm gonna turn to Chris, because we're just now talking about trust. And trust is, of course, a very valued commodity. And if there's one thing that we've learned from the few years of hyperbole, the few years of some early failures, some early traction in the field of blockchain, we know that blockchain and distributed ledger technologies can provide a new way of establishing that trust. So can you talk a bit about how data science is changing to enable very trustful applications, and where you see blockchain going in this environment, in this data trust environment?
Yeah. So first, I was maybe one of the ones who raised their hand on none of the above.
Yeah.
Not because I don't trust those players. Those players could have the best of intentions, the best processes, the best ways of handling data. The problem is a technological problem. It is that when we have a system that aggregates data in central repositories, we create honeypots. Data is valuable, particularly personal data, particularly data about finances, banking systems, credit cards. When we concentrate that in one place, we create enormous incentives for bad actors to go in, and it has nothing to do with whether we trust the players or not. The fact is, in today's society with today's technology, it's very, very hard to harden a data silo to make it impregnable, right? When you can access the Iranian nuclear system that's been air-gapped, right, then anything is possible. So the solution seems to me to move away from systems that centralize data. It's not about the trust of the actor, it's about the trust of the technology. And one of the really interesting potentials of blockchains is to decentralize data, to avoid creating those honeypots. One of our members is a foundation called the Sovereign Foundation. The Sovereign Foundation was selected by the Hyperledger Linux Foundation and their project Indy, and the whole purpose of it is to allow individuals to create self-sovereign data where the algorithms have to go to the data, right? And the individual doesn't have to give up the data, right? All of their data about personal health, credit card, to some central repository. So interesting technology. It's still out there. These are still very early days, but that is at least a solution to the trust problem.
I just want to jump in on one quick thing, which is that for the 84 games, Los Angeles built or started building what remains one of the most extensive and sophisticated traffic management centers in the world. It's called ATSAC, which stands for Automated Traffic Surveillance and Control. It's a 5,000 interconnected intersections. And one of the founding principles of ATSAC, it operates on top of sensors and cameras, was that none of those cameras record. So they only offer a real-time view into what's going on in the city at any given point, so that an engineer sitting downtown Los Angeles can have eyes on an intersection in Pacoima during the middle of a heat storm, and discover, what's going on those streets. And it was a really important solve for not wanting, guarding against government overreach, right? Which is recorded data being used by authorities, to Regina's point, to target, populations, or to, under the guise of maybe fighting crime or gathering traffic data, that we wanted to guard against that. That solution where information comes in but is never stored anywhere isn't going to work if we are going to be able to continue to manage digital infrastructure. And you had a question earlier about real-time needs versus a longer view. There's an amazing work by this woman, Dr. Ann Brown. I think she's actually at the University of Oregon now, who was able to gather data from Uber, Lyft, and the taxi fleets in Los Angeles and uncover that there was tremendous racial bias and profiling happening in the publicly managed fleet that wasn't happening to the same extent in the privately operated fleets. That's an important insight that we need, that is a long game view that requires data to be stored, analyzed, and understood to get at real problems. So I think there are important roles for nonprofit foundations and companies like Hyperledger to start thinking about that problem, divorced from government or business.
On that, please go ahead.
Just curious about that study. What data was she using to form those conclusions?
So some of it was data that she got from Uber and Lyft themselves, and then some of it was data that she collected and created by doing basically original research. She had students, African American students, Latinx students, white students who dressed exactly the same. and had profile pictures that were neutral, and would call for a taxi, an Uber, or a Lyft from the same neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and measure response times for white students versus non-white students, and also measure whether the rate of trip completion. So some trips never even, the taxi fleet never even picking up a call, at much higher rates for non-whites.
It's fascinating.
Can I ask a question about capacity and skills in the public sector and the private sector? Clearly, Chris, you were talking about solutions that do require a certain level of training, understanding of some of these new data changes in data science and some of these new data standards and data methodologies that are emerging. And that requires a population of trained data scientists, data analysts. Now, those tend to go to the private sector for a number of reasons, because of pay, because of the conditions. Salita, do you find it hard to keep on board in the public sector those people that have the skill set that you require to carry out your mission around data? And does that mean that because of that mismatch, that we are looking at a model where we, for structural reasons, outsource a lot of data analytics in the public sector?
Yeah, so we've, it's funny, I think, Philippe, you and I have been having this conversation long enough so that 2 years ago, my answer was, we don't even have a data scientist classification in the civil service system in Los Angeles. We do now for the first time. It took 2 years, right? And even once we have it, how long is the inherent joy and of public service going to outcompete equity in a ground floor offer at a new startup, or a salary that, because tech companies are competing on talent, and we are always going to struggle to do that. So I think there's two realities. One, there will be constant churn in that classification, because I think that you do have people who want to come into government and really do like and believe in the mission of what government is trying to accomplish, get experience, and then potentially take that into the private sector. That happens across the board. I think that will be intense in that particular classification. So we have to manage around that. We have to have constantly open, hiring activity in that classification, and overhire, because we know the vacancy rates in that class are going to be really high.
You students out there, overhiring taking place at LAD.
Overhiring. The second thing we have to do is form alliances. So Jean Holm was up here earlier. She came up with this brilliant sort of data science federation, which is a partnership between LA and a collection of enormously fantastic universities and data students in those universities to solve real problems and do real work with the city. But then we are also going to have to contract it out. We're going to have to procure it and pay for it sort of on a data scientist as a service kind of model.
On that specific point, Chris, how easy or difficult is it for you to find qualified data scientists that are working on blockchain and distributed ledger technologies that ingest a lot of this data?
So Moby's a nonprofit. We have no engineers, so I have no demand, so I have no problem with supply.
In the field.
But what we and our partners find is a lot of developers are motivated by the vision, and it's fairly easy to get in the larger communities, the Ethereum community, the Hyperledger community, some very, very smart people working in data science and other areas working on these problems.
Regina?
So I came from a PhD in transportation, undergrad computer science, and I found that when I graduated, a lot of people, this is a while ago, who were finishing PhDs in transportation, who knew a lot about transportation modeling and data, who were capable of being data scientists, a lot of them wanted to be academics still at that point in time. But that's
even you?
Even me. But that's rapidly changed. So, the last 5 cohort at UC Berkeley, at MIT, I would say about 80 to 90+% of them now go to work for Uber and Lyft because they're 2 of the largest employers, or now, Lime and Bird because they're also quite large very rapidly. And that was the challenge that I was seeing because I'm, in my DNA from my past 20 years of professional experience have really been focused on solving public sector problems. Which is why I felt the need to form a company like Populous that could help serve as a trusted third party to basically be the outsourced solution for cities that may not have the capability of hiring and retaining data engineers and scientists.
Lisa Joy, did you have something? No. So we're hitting the end of our talk. I just want to raise one issue and have a quick yes-no answer from all of you. And that's, we're talking data, a lot about data. Let's talk about how it's used, literally how it's used, by code and by algorithms. And the interesting thing, there's the famous Danish architect Jan Gehl said, first we shape our cities, then our cities shape us. Now I imagine that a mid-21st century architect, maybe not necessarily in Denmark, might say, first we shaped the code, then the code shaped us. Now, algorithms are mediating, they're curating, they're nudging, they're changing our behavior in a number of spheres, including in transport. But in that sense, algorithms govern, they change our behavior, but they're not government. So my question to you is, this discussion that we're having now about data, do you think that next year or very soon we'll be having a similar discussion about algorithms, how to assess their impact, how to integrate them as you do already with MDS, how to integrate algorithms into the regulatory task, and maybe even think about discussing ways in which to regulate algorithms. So do you think the focus that we're having right now on data will be a focus later on algorithms? Yes, no, and for time purposes, I hate to ask you to just leave it to that, but then people will come up and ask you about that afterwards. So Regina, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Show of hands, yes? All right, so next year we know what the session will be. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of my speakers,
Thank you.
for participating, and thank you for listening.